Okay, in this video I'm going to be taking you through how to go about answering some particularly difficult relative price questions. So starting with sort of your key relative price questions, which we looked about a little bit about in class, and then some really tricky questions related to resource allocation. When you are answering questions on the relative prices and the price mechanism, these are some sort of key words you want to understand, so make sure that you have a good definition of what's meant by the market mechanism, the force of demand and supply interacting to determine prices, what is meant by relative prices, and the fact that relative prices send price signals to suppliers. It's a really important concept. That firms are profit maximizing, so always can use that term that businesses aim to maximize their profits, and therefore they devote their resources to more profitable areas. Always have that in your answers related to any questions about the market mechanism or how resources are allocated in competitive markets. And the change in relative prices are what leads to a change in the allocation of resources. So generally, if you get any question about like how resources are allocated in a perfectly competitive market, how changes in relative prices impact resources, how the price mechanism determines what is produced, how the price mechanism can solve shortages, the logic you're using in all these sentences, these questions is pretty much exactly the same. You're defining key terms, which is the perfectly competitive market or relative prices in this case, explaining what causes the changes in prices, which is demand and supply, linking that to how that acts for producers as price signals, and then that idea of profit motivation, and then providing an example. So all of your answers will have those same key terminology. Defining the price mechanism, linking to relative prices, linking it to the profit motive for producers, and then using examples to explain how that reallocates resources. So, for example, with reference to relative prices, explain how higher oil prices might impact the market for scooters. Okay, if that was a 4-mark question, define relative prices, and then you're really explaining, the language can be complicated, but you're really explaining what's happening in these markets. So petrol is needed to drive a car, or it's a complementary good, and therefore the cost of running a car is now relatively higher. So consumers will look for a cheaper transport to cars, increasing the demand for substitutes due to their lower relative price. So it's cheaper to use a scooter as opposed to driving a car. This will increase the demand for scooters. This leads to a shortage in the market for scooters, and therefore an increase in the relative price compared to other products. And then you're linking it to that resource allocation. Producers will shift more resources into the production of scooters due to the higher relative price and therefore the higher profits. More resources are also likely going into the drilling of oil potentially, because it's now more profitable because it's more expensive. But overall in the market for transport, more resources will be going into scooters. Again, in a competitive market, explain how the price mechanism allocates resources. Again, this was talked about in the other video, but it's about talking about the role of relative prices and their signaling function. Don't talk about everything you know about markets. Don't just talk about efficiency. So first thing you want to do is you want to define what's meant by a perfectly competitive market. And we'll be talking about this a little bit more in class this week, but having a really clear definition of a perfectly competitive market. In a competitive market, it's relative prices that determine what is produced amongst their competing uses. And then in an example, when demand or supply changes, it results in a change in relative prices. That acts as a price signal to economic agents as to where to allocate their resources. Don't talk too much about consumers. We're talking about the behavior of producers here, so you don't really need to be talking about the motivations of consumers. Then provide an example. There's an increase in the demand for gold that leads to a higher relative price, which encourages producers to allocate more resources to gold. Existing gold miners might expand their operations. Resources have been reallocated from one sector to another because relative prices have changed. You could talk about the carbon tax here and how a higher relative price causes resources to shift out of an industry because it raises their production costs, but it doesn't matter which example you use. Again, another question explains how a change in relative prices impact resource allocation. Only 43% get full mark. The average mark is around 43%, so about 1.8 out of 4 for this type of question. Again, you start with a definition of relative prices. Explain that relative prices are what acts as a signal to producers and consumers, which determines what they produce. An increase in the relative price of one good compared to another means that more resources will generally flow to that good because it's more profitable. Provide an example, in this case strawberries, encourages farmers to allocate, make sure you say what resources are, to the production of strawberries. You could also provide an example of how relative prices impact resources in factor markets, because all the question asks is how resources are reallocated because of relative prices. So you could use an example of the how to produce function, and therefore resources will use more capital when wage rises, and this may encourage firms to reduce their employment and increase capital because of the decreased profits if they're paying higher wages. So the mining boom, if you use that as your example, explain what caused the higher relative price. China demanding our iron ore. Explain what happened initially with the shortage that existed, and therefore that leading to higher prices. And then real clear example of how that reallocated resources. Land once used for recreation and schools is dig up for minerals. Truck drivers, surveyors, tradespeople, etc. went and worked on the mines. BHP and Rio Tinto expanded their investment and started building new mines as well to try and take advantage of this boom. I'm just going to go through 3 other tricky questions with you for the rest of this video. So assuming that the production costs of oil producers were moderately steady, explain the effect on the allocation of resources of higher oil prices. So if oil prices go up, but it's not a supply side factor, explain which particular industries will attract extra resources and which areas would repel resources as a result of this price signal. So higher oil prices are likely to act as an incentive for self-interested producers to shift more resources into the production of oil. Self-interested producers will use more resources, land, labour and capital to extract oil out of the ground in order to reap the profits. So there's going to be more resources into the extraction of oil because it is more profitable because of the higher price. Some industries will benefit as a result of these higher prices while others will suffer. So the market for LPG will benefit as the higher price means that more people will substitute into this market and demand should increase. So more consumers might want to be willing to install gas tanks because the price of oil or petrol is more expensive. Considerable resources will be also devoted to public transport and bikes as a means of transport, as the higher oil prices makes it more expensive to drive petrol-driven cars. Industries that will suffer, other than car companies, include businesses that rely on oil to generate production, as this will lift their production costs and erode their profit margins. This includes construction companies, manufacturing industries, other industries that may suffer from the reduced discretionary income of consumers because they're paying more for petrol may also suffer. So really clearly explaining how the oil producers will respond to the higher price by allocating more resources to oil, how some industries like LPG will benefit, and well as bikes and public transport because it's more cheaper to run your car on gas and therefore there's more demand, and some other industries that rely on oil, e.g. construction and manufacturing, will suffer due to the lower relative profits. Explain how the theory of elasticity influenced the allocation of resources. So elasticity can have a large impact on the allocation of resources. If products have an elastic demand and there's an increase in price, it's likely to generate significantly less revenue. So for example, if a car company experiences large increases in production costs, they will lose considerable revenue if they pass these increased costs on to consumers. So if the price of cars went up because of higher production costs, we'd likely to see a large amount of resources be reallocated away from that industry because it's hard for them to make a profit and they can't afford to charge consumers the higher price because they're very responsive to price changes. So if the price go up for an elastic good because of production costs, we'd likely see resources, which is the point of this question, move out of that industry. On the other hand, if demand is inelastic, firms can generally pass on price increases and do not need to reallocate resources. So for example, if there's a higher price of cigarettes because of a tax, it may not have the same impact on the reallocation of resources. If a product has an elastic supply, they can quickly reallocate their land, labour and capital resources in response to market signals. So we're talking about elastic supply now. For example, if the price of apples tripled, resources could be quickly reallocated to the production due to high factor mobility. This would not be the case if the demand for doctors increase, as they have a more inelastic supply, so resources would not be moved as quickly. So this is a really challenging question, but what it's getting you to ask is, alright, how does it matter if a product's elastic as opposed to inelastic if the price goes up, how that will affect resource allocation, particularly if it's due to higher production costs, and how is that different to if the demand for something goes up and something has an elastic versus inelastic supply. If it's elastic, there will be quickly more resources allocated, and if it's inelastic, it will take time for us to supply more to the market. We'll talk about this question in class.